we're going to assemble this lovely, fully functional 2-speed transmission. So let's start with a tour of the parts. The first thing you should do when you get this kit is spread out all the parts in a place where you're not going to lose them and separate them by type. So organized by size and diameter and things like that, so that we'll be able to identify the correct ones. So first we have this group of screws that are all the same. These are the 1/2-inch screws. Then we have a whole bunch of nuts. And we have one nut that's different. This is a lock nut, so that will come later. And then we have 2 tiny little screws and tiny little nuts. Those are separate. And here we have 4 different lengths of screw that are all longer than these guys. There's a very long one and 3 separate lengths. We'll be addressing these each one at a time. And an extra long shaft that has no head on it. And then there's actually 4 thicknesses of plastic washer. These very thin, just like film thickness, very thin washers. These, which are about 3 millimeters, about 1/8 of an inch thick. These are 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch, and one really thick one. And then we have these 3 square washers. They have a round hole, but a square outside diameter. And then all the other parts will come to as we get to them. So we start with the output shaft. This is the long thing with no head on it. Take that and take one of these nuts, screw it on, and then we're actually going to use 3 of these washers just as spacers to measure where this nut needs to go. So we'll take 1, 2 of the square washers and 1 of the second thinnest, the 1/8 inch or 3 millimeter washers. Put that and then screw the nut until the end of the shaft is just roughly flush with the end. It doesn't have to be exact. It can be just somewhere in that general range. And take these off. We now have the nut in the right place, so don't turn it. Turn the shaft around, and now we're going to put all 3 of these square washers on it. Actually, this one, you notice it still has a little piece of plastic inside. That's okay. Just push and it'll pop right out. So you see it's popping out. Some of them will come that way. It's just a question whether they fell out. So 1, 2, 3 square washers, and then this piece of white square tube that goes over, and you may have to force it down a little bit, but it will go over all 3 of those washers. So it's now held nicely centered. And it's intentional that the washers are a little bit longer than the tube. It's meant to stick out there. Okay, then find this piece. All the acrylic pieces, with the exception of this one, need to be peeled. But this one comes pre-peeled. So you take that, and it's got a square hole that fits on the square shaft. It should slide easily. Then again, without letting that nut turn very much, take another nut, thread it on the other end, and spin it down, and get it finger tight. And don't worry if this turns a little bit. It just needs to stay roughly where it was. Then we're going to use these 2 wrenches to tighten this. We want to get this quite tight. It's a little tricky to hold it in place, but there we go. So after it's finger tight, something like a good 1/2 a turn, even 3/4 of a turn. You want it pretty tight, because if they come loose, then your whole transmission will jam up. And this should continue to slide easily. So that completes the output shaft. Now we're going to build the shifting armature. I think it's called an armature. So all these pieces are nice and clear here, but when you get the kit, they will be covered with blue plastic film that needs to be peeled off. Everything that's not crystal clear has a film on it. These pieces here, they come with sort of a milky white film that may not be obviously a film to start with, but if it's not crystal clear, peel something off of it until it is. So, start with these guys. You notice that they have one side that's a little bit lower, goes a little bit longer down than the other side. Let's hold that one down. And then we want to take these 2 tiny screws and put them in from the back. Hold it in place with your finger. Okay, now we have them both there. And now we want to take one of these very thin pieces, shaped like that, And there's two different ways it can go. It can go this way, but if you put it this way, then you see the curvature here doesn't match the curvature here, so that's wrong. Flip it over and put it on here. So these are sort of concentric, two circles together. And then this thicker piece, 3mm piece, again, put it on there in the correct way so the curves match. And then the second very thin piece goes on there. And then the second of these, and again, match the longer side to the longer side. Put it on there, so now we have a little sandwich. And then we would take these tiny little nuts. We give you an extra one because they're very easy to lose. I find the easiest way is just sort of hold the nut in place and then use the screwdriver to tighten. And we don't want to tighten this, just sort of barely snugged up. And then the second one. And again, not quite tight. Okay, now, it's still loose, so it can still move. That's important. So now we take one of the large nuts, and we're going to slide it into the slot there. And if it's not going in, if you have to push hard, that's because it's rotated in the wrong angle. You want to have the two flats on the sides going straight down. When it's right, it'll go in. Get it right? Yes, there we go. It'll go in quite easily. You have to push a little bit, but not much. And you can use the screwdriver to push it the rest of the way. And looking down the end, push it down until you see that the hole is centered. And you can take any one of these other screws here, temporarily thread it into the nut, just as a way of checking that it's properly centered. And then take that screw back out again. So now we're ready to tighten it. So we want to set it down on a flat surface. And that will get these things aligned with each other so they're both parallel. And then we want to sort of press down this piece in the middle. It shouldn't be sticking up at all. And then you can tighten it. So you don't really need a wrench on the other side because the nuts pretty well bind. And sort of tighten it alternately a few times so that they're both evenly tight. Okay, now we have this thing. Okay, now, again, hold it with the long side down, find this piece, and hold it with the slot lower down, sort of on the lower half. And that will match up with the longer side there. It goes through there. Except that I realize we first have to get the screw. So we want to take the longest of these three intermediate screws, not the really long one, but the longest of the three similarly long screws. Take that and add a nut to it. And screw that nut halfway or so up. Okay, now we're ready for this. Take this with the long side down and the slot in the lower half. Put it together like that. And find this piece, put it on there, and then the screw goes through that piece, through the slot, and into that little nut. And now we're going to screw this in. And we don't want to screw it tight. We don't want to have the ends of the screw actually visible beyond the end of that nut. Just screw it until it's flush with the bottom of the nut, which you can see through the plastic quite clearly. And then get this sort of squared up so this piece is square to that piece, and then tighten the nut, but not the screw, which we'll do using a wrench. You can just tighten it. The screw may try to turn a little bit, and that's okay. What we're trying to not do is we don't want to apply pressure to the bottom of the plastic there and potentially crack it. So get it until it's sort of mostly tight. Then you can tighten it. Don't over tighten, but just get it tightened in there. And this should move freely like that. If it doesn't move freely, probably something is out of whack. Maybe these pieces are not square with each other. Something like that. Okay, so that is the shifting armature thing. Okay, next we're going to put together the crank. If you've got the electric version of this, you won't have a crank, so you can ignore this section. For that, we'll use the shortest of the three longer screws, not the very shortest screws, through the crank, and then take the longest, thickest washer, 1/2 inch thick, 12 millimeters, through there. Take a nut, on and tighten with the screwdriver. Now we have the crank, so that's our third subassembly. Now we're ready to actually start putting together the main structure of it. So you'll find two pieces that look very similar, but they're not quite the same. This one has a little extra space above the tabs here, the slots, and it has an extra little hole there. We wanted to start with the one that has the extra hole. And then you'll find two pieces like this, which again look quite similar, but are not quite the same. This one has 3 holes here, and this one just has 1. They both have 1 hole on the other side, but this one has 3. Ignore the logo on this piece. That may or may not be on yours. We're moving the logo around. You want to pick the one that has 3 holes in a row there. Okay, so now using the one with 3 holes and the one with a little extra hole, they go together. So we find the side of this that doesn't have an angle, that's just square step like that. That goes together with the side that has a little hole in it, a little extra hole. So that goes in there. Now we're going to put the first of many of these T-slot joints together. So I'm holding it with one finger underneath there to stop this nut from falling through. Take the nut, and again, if you put it in here and it doesn't slide in easily, that's because it's not turned right. Get it to the 2 flat sides parallel like that, and it will go in. It'll either fall right through or it'll stick very lightly. Usually they fall through. So that one is holding just barely, but I've got my finger there. Then we take one of these large group of short screws, stick it in, and the nut will sort of center itself automatically, and then just tighten it. You want to tighten them, get it snug, but don't go overboard. Okay. Now we take the other base, this piece, and it doesn't matter which way, it goes either way. It goes on the other side next to the first one. And we do the same thing with one nut in here and a short screw. As soon as you have the screw pressed in there, it becomes much less delicate, less likely to fall out. So we can tighten that. Okay, now we have something that will stand up. And from here we're going to basically assemble the interior of the transmission in place here. So we start with the output shaft and find the shorter end. That's going to go this way. So then we want to take these 2 gears here. These will again come with film on. You'll have to peel them off. You want to take the larger of these gears that has this pink thing attached to it, and it goes on the end of that shaft. And then we take one of these 5mm washers. It's the second or third thickest, second from the thickest. Anyway, this size. Put that on there, and then hold the other end of the shaft and put the small gear with the pink thing facing in. You notice how the pink things are facing in towards each other. They will mesh with the green thing there. And then another one of these 5mm washers goes on there. And this is now ready to slide into the hole on the bottom of the panel. Stick it in there, and if you just sort of let it go down, it will hold itself in place well enough. It shouldn't fall apart. Okay, now we're going to test fit the other half of this. So get it oriented so that it's the same orientation as the one in the back, and slide the shaft through the hole, and then you sort of angle it in. Sticks a little bit, and you sort of want to gently pull these apart. Don't pull them apart any more than necessary, and this will snap in place. Okay, so this is how it's going to be. And what we want to check for now is how much play is there. See how this wobbles back and forth? And because the thickness of this acrylic is not completely consistent, you may or may not need to add a few of these little spacer washers, these very thin washers. This looks to me like one washer would be a good amount to add. You want to have some play here, but not too much. So let's try adding one washer. Just pull this apart and pushing that back, slide this forward, and add one washer. If you're going to add more than one washer, put one on either side. But you probably don't need more than one, at most two. And then slide this back in. And now, okay, so this is perfect. Now there's wiggle. You do want to have wiggle like that so it can spin freely, but it doesn't wiggle any more than necessary. Okay, now we take this part again because we're just test fitting that. And make sure the little washer actually stays on there. Sometimes it tries to stick to the plastic. Okay. Now we can assemble the upper shaft. So that, we're going to use this long screw with a head on it. And holding this so that it's together, the same orientation, so we're doing this right. We take this screw and put it through this way. And then we're going to put a nut on it. And screw it almost all the way down. Now we don't want to tighten this. In fact, it's important that there be a little bit of play here, because this needs to be able to spin. So there should just be a little... no, not this one yet. Actually, we put a washer on first. You'll probably make this sort of mistake many times, I certainly do. Washer first. This is the 3 millimeter, the thinnest one that's not the little gasket thickness. Washer, and then the nut. Okay, now again, we don't want it tight. We want to have enough play that this can spin very freely like that, and we'll fine tune that later. Okay, now again we have two gears. These are the plain gears without any pink stuff on them. And we'll start with the large one. Goes on, and then another nut. And at this point we're just putting these nuts on very, very loosely. We need the thing to be able to move around. So don't, it'll wobble and move around, that's okay. And then another nut. And this one you can leave maybe, 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch, something like that, some space in there that will all get fine-tuned. Then the small gear, and another nut, and another of these 3 millimeter washers goes on there. Now we can assemble these things together. So first thing to go in is the bottom shaft there, goes into the bottom hole. And then the top shaft here goes in through the top hole. And then you have to sort of slide it together as far as it'll go flat. And then again, very gently spread these two pieces. And it will snap in place. And now we have both shafts ready to go. And we can now actually put the screws in for this to hold it. So we put a screw or nut here. Screw. And a nut here. And a screw. That nut went a little too far. Let's see if it gets pulled back in. Pull back into place. And tighten that up. That. Okay, and now we're going to put the back plate on there. So that's this piece, and it only goes one way, so if you try to put it on and it doesn't fit, flip it top to bottom, then it will fit. And here we can put the nuts in. Go ahead and put all 4 nuts in. Just right so it slides in. one's actually fitting a little bit tightly. That will happen sometimes, but it's okay. As long as you have the flats up and down, right, you can push it in. And that one's very loose. There's a certain tolerance to the parts. Not perfect. Okay, I got those 4. And now we'll put 4 screws in. Now we're going to adjust and tighten these nuts. So the first step is make sure this first one, the one closest to the head, is not tight but backed off by maybe a 1/16 or less of an inch, a millimeter or so. So just this amount of play. And then holding the screw so it doesn't turn, and the gear so it doesn't turn, just gently tighten that nut up against it. You can use your finger or a screwdriver or whatever, but we're not going to tighten it yet. Okay, now we want to take this nut at the opposite end and spin it out in this direction until it just touches the wall here, and then back it up by half a turn or a turn. So this should click back and forth just a little bit. Then slide the gear over and spin this nut up against that. Okay, now we can use the 2 wrenches to tighten these and sort of turn them both at the same time. Get them quite tight. And here also. Quite tight. And then check again that it's got the right amount of play. So this is just right. If it's too tight, if it doesn't have some wiggle to it, then loosen that one and tighten that one a little bit, and just sort of alternate until it's spinning freely. It should be, able to spin quite freely. Okay, now we're going to install the shifting mechanism. So take this, and the longer side goes down, and position it so that this disc here goes between those 2 arms, like that, and it fits onto the slots. And then we put a nut on either side. Now we need to assemble the shift lever, and I forgot to peel this one ahead of time, so we will have to actually peel that on camera. Okay, this is the shift arm. So these pieces are going to go, that one will go there, and this one will go here. And they first need to be attached to each other. So we're going to put a nut in. And a short screw. And another nut. Short screw. Okay, and now a slightly tricky part. So we take the remaining longish screw, stick it through here so it's on the same side as that, and put the nut on, and we tighten this down really tight, and then you find the spring, set the spring on, and then one of the 3mm, not very thin but medium thin washers. And this is where you can go wrong, because if you let this go, it will fly across the room and you will never ever find it again. So keep a finger on that. Now take the shift lever, and with that depressed out of the way, see I'm holding the spring down, goes through the slot there and onto the screw like this. And now holding this, you can let go of the spring and this will hold it in place. And now we're going to use the one special nut, this lock nut, which you notice is a little thicker and has this extra sort of ring on the top, which has a piece of plastic in it that's going to bind on the threads. So we put it on with the plastic side up. The locking ring is up, and screw it on, and you're now safe. It will no longer fly apart. Taking the wrench, we want to tighten the lock nut. And you'll see it immediately starts gripping and not wanting to turn. That's what it's meant to do. So that's why you need the wrench to tighten it. And you want to keep tightening until this lever is close to parallel, pretty much parallel with that. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you see it's on a spring here, so it can go back and forth like that. Okay, and now we're ready to install this onto the model. So these forks go on either side of that screw, slips in from the top and fits onto its tabs there. And now we take a nut, very close to done. So next we attach the wrench and or the crank. If you got the electrified version, you're watching the wrong video, because we're going to have a separate video that shows how to put together the electrified version, and you won't have a crank. Put this on. We want to get this crank pretty much as far out as it can go, so just flush with the end of the screw and then back up the nut inside. Wrench. Get those two tight. Okay, now we're almost done. We just need the wheel. So the wheel I've intentionally not peeled it, just because I want to show that it is in fact possible to pull off this plastic. Some people have trouble getting blue plastic off, but it can be done. Just sort of started it there and then slowly pull towards the middle, and then go around, and look, it comes off in one piece every time. Then we do the other side. There seems to be some kind of an art to peeling this blue plastic without frustration, and maybe I've just done it so many times now that I no longer appreciate how annoying it is. But there you go, one piece. Okay, that's actually not a failure of blue plastic peeling. That's actually a piece that the laser cutter didn't fully remove. So we push it and it pops out. So the last step is to attach the wheel. So we'll start with a nut, and I'm actually going to use the mechanism itself, which I have to crank backwards to slide the nut on just because I can. And then the wheel, and then another nut. Okay, and now we can use the two wrenches. Let's spin that back a little bit. Okay, get a wrench on this one, and a wrench on this one, and tighten it. And it is now finished. So you crank it, and to shift it, you move the shift lever like that. That's low gear, L there for low gear, and H for high gear. And when you look inside, you can see how that clutch disc in the middle is shifted. When it's in the middle here, it's sort of a neutral. And it comes over here, it engages with the other gear, and now it's back in low gear. That's neutral and high gear. And that is the acrylic functional 2-speed transmission.